evening, ladies and gentlemen. That was a terribly spooky delay there. I'm going to be making at least 2 more jokes about how things are being spooky, and luckily you've passed one of them now. Considering it is nearly Halloween, I figured that we'd actually kind of consider the most frightening thing of all, which is self-reflection. So I would look at one thing that I do far too often, and also look at a tool by which we tend to look back at ourselves. So we'll start off with just a little bit of a quiz. First one, who amongst you are familiar with tarot cards? Just on a show of hands. Keep your hands up if you've ever been for a reading. Okay, and put your hands up if you own a pack. Oh, interesting. Okay, so tarot have existed in the form they have for about 400 years. They are a pack of 78 playing cards, essentially, with a split between 4 different suits. And then also the major arcana, which is what we're going to kind of look through today. They've been used as a tool for divination, typically because they'll give ideas and they'll be able to focus on things like this. Who is familiar with the light gun game House of the Dead? Fantastic. Keep your hand if you've ever finished either or any of them. Oh, amazing. Most of the hands who went up, it seems to kind of like force an obsession as we go through this. So today what we're going to look at is a kind of intermingling of the two. Because what I find really fascinating about this series in total is the fact that the House of the Dead major bosses, with the exception of the game they released on the Wii, are all named after the major arcana of the tarot. And there's a certain amount that we're going to kind of like link together to consider that. So I'm Sean Smith, or Sean F. Smith on Twitter. And there are 2 things that are relevant here in terms of why I'm up here today. One, I'm a magician, so I will do magical things, and that's largely where I got my interest in the tarot from. But as well as that, I teach English, which is where I got my interest in semiology from. So we're going to kind of combine the 2 of them here. And in fact, as we go through this today, if you want to, I mean, I won't be able to do it now on account of being stood up on stage, but if you want to tweet me with your favourite boss from the game, I will give you a miniature reading about what that means about you. Because that's essentially what we're doing today. One of 2 things. One, which is essentially the highbrow version, where if I'm attempting to get funding, this is what I'd ask for. Essentially, we're going to be looking at how you can use one tool to look at a different thing in terms of how the symbology of that kind of reveals a certain amount of things. And the more fun thing, and the spooky thing, which is the self-reflection, so kind of using something and then kind of linking that back and trying to work out what that means about you. So for about the 60% of you that did put your hands up, as we go through, pick your favourite boss, the one that you absolutely enjoy fighting. That's going to tell you something positive about it. And the boss you always die on, that will be the inverted card, which comes out unluckily. I'm going to kind of go through this. So this is now going to be a long list of 18 different people on account of the fact that of all of these games, so despite the fact that there was one game on the Wii, there are 3 major arcana that have not existed in any of these video games. We have the High Priestess, we have the Devil, and we have the Moon. And this is the very reason why I'm expecting and hoping that at the very far end of this there will still be a House of the Dead 5 that I'll be able to come across in an arcade if the arcades don't all shut down by that point. So again, as we said earlier, the major arcana all have specific names. That's primarily what we're looking at today. We then also have the minor arcana, so we have the swords, which have now become spades. We have the wands, which are now clubs. Pentacles turn to diamonds, and then cups, just over the far end, which are now hearts. But in total, actually, the things that are more interesting are the unique direct identities of the major arcana. And we'll kind of go through that at a relatively breakneck speed. So, first up, number 0 is the Fool, almost always typically shown just about to walk off a cliff. So the fact that he's always going to fall to his death. He's carefree, he's enjoyable, he knows this thing. The Fool in House of the Dead is not going to fall off a cliff, and in fact he is one of the things which stays on the walls as best as he possibly can. The Fool himself kind of sets up a really interesting thing we see. The ideology we get from the actual tarot themselves tends to be inverted entirely when we actually look at it through the state of this game, in the same way that we're looking at the dead rather than the living. So the Fool himself grabs on. If you love the Fool, this is going to tell you that the sort of person you are very, very good at holding on to something very specific, whereas if you always die at the Fool, it's because you're too stubborn and maybe you should change more. This is kind of, this is one of those, like, this is the 3rd spooky thing of the night. This is the MySpace reference. When I was first on MySpace, I called myself Type 0 because I have been a magician for many years, and I figured that this was a slightly more cyberpunk way of making reference to it. Something which no one else has found, and to be fair, I've not necessarily written out elsewhere. The magician, again, it tends to be in control of all of the other elements. So if you notice, we've got all of the other suits present in terms of on this card himself. The Magician, again, is one of the most intelligent bosses in the game. Keeps reappearing more and more times. In fact, if you play the special edition of the 4th game, he again appears right at the very end of this. Most intelligent, most recurrent, and essentially most interesting at that point. If the Magician is your favourite, you're a know-it-all. If you keep dying at him, it's because actually you are a lot more sensible, more grounded in life. The Empress, House of the Dead 4 we have here. So the Empress herself tends to refer to the natural world. And so what's quite interesting in terms of the boss fight, instead, we end up that we're going through a tunnel that's specifically been built by man, we're in a tube train, and the tube train keeps getting chopped up by an enormous double-ended chainsaw-wielding zombie, which is then attempting to kill you as you run down this train. Again, it's a situation where you're kind of fleeing, you're trying to kind of keep up on top of certain ideas, all of these different things. The Empress herself, if you love her, she's particularly good literally at thinking about all the different specific parts of things. If you always die at her, and it's because actually in the long run, you're kind of doing things that are too unnatural. We'll kind of pick up a little bit of pace. Emperor, final boss of the 2nd game. The Emperor himself has one of my favourite lines of dialogue, which follows one of the worst lines of dialogue in any video game, where Goldman, the intelligent protagonist, or the intelligent antagonist of the entire game, says right before you fight, his perfect being, the Emperor, literally speaks to the protagonist saying, "This is the final battle," in case you were not quite aware of why you've been going all the way through. And again, one of the really interesting things about, essentially, is the way light gun games are designed. You're always going to have the actual weak spots of the enemies kind of pointed out to you as you go through. The final bosses never quite know this. The Emperor, again, it's a case of its control of everything, whereas the Empress herself is more in terms of the natural world. The Emperor tends to focus more on the people amongst them. Hierophant, and here's actually where we start seeing some really interesting things if we're looking at both things together. The Hierophant is one of the reasons I like to go to Venice, on account of the fact that's where he appears. But again, if we look at the cards here, the Hierophant is almost always shown holding a staff. And actually the boss itself in the fight, again, has got a large trident, the same weapon which we tend to use from one thing to the next. And also, probably the only tarot card which again represents a light gun game because you can see the 2 players down in the bottom corners. This is an announcement. The next boss are some spiders. If you don't like to look at them, don't look now. In what appears to be essentially a comment on masculinity, the most fragile part of this boss is the tiny little man on the back of his wife. And again, this is a really interesting thing. So the cards that I'm looking at here are the Rider-Waite tarot cards. They're the ones that are typically going to be most popular. They're the ones you buy in a lot of places. They were designed back in 1910. Again, Rider-Waite is really interesting for how much imagery we have here. We've got fig tree on this side, where obviously lots of fig leaves which aren't yet over the genitals of our characters there. And we also have an apple tree with a snake coiled around it. So obviously fans of Christian mythology should be able to pick up on all the references here. The lovers themselves don't. The lovers themselves are spiders. They'll climb up a lift shaft where you try and shoot them in the face. But again, it kind of points out a relatively interesting thing. Despite the fact that in House of the Dead we have lots and lots of deaths. We've got lots of people coming back from beyond the grave. We've got this whole idea about what science is attempting to do. There is almost no religion in the entirety of this game. And as such, its absence becomes something that's even more interesting to spot when we're looking at another tool that's kind of relatively similar. The spiders are now gone. They are replaced by the Chariot. The Chariot is the first thing you find inside in Curian's Manor in House of the Dead 1, and is entirely encased in his own armour until you manage to shoot it off, and he becomes a really quite terrifying skeleton with lots of weird tendrils. Again, the Chariot's really interesting from the perspective of it's a tool. It's how you're using one thing to talk about something else. If you always lose to the Chariot, maybe it's the fact that you're relying on outside systems too often. How am I doing for time? Is that right?
About 5 minutes.
Cool, sorry. Strength, again, we get another situation here, where we're looking at, in terms of one of the segments here, strength in the card. We see the fact that we've got a lion, almost always either the drawers being pulled open or the drawers being pulled closed. It's something natural, it's something powerful. Whereas in strength, the boss, we instead have the fact that we have a large, again chainsaw-wielding man who chases you through the ruins of the Colosseum. and the differences between what seemed to be natural and what seemed to be like visible. But again, if we kind of think back to Roman mythology, not even Roman mythology, but Roman history, quite often within the Colosseum you would have beasts such as lions being used, and this image very much of strength, the very image of the fact that here is something which is powerful, here are things we're looking at. Again, more spiders. Although to look at it, it doesn't really look like a spider, which is slightly worrying. The Hermit, again, is very interesting. The Hermit almost always draws himself away from things, and in fact, as you're shooting him, the Hermit is the one boss which is kind of escaping and is running away from you as you go through. With its name, you'd imagine it to be more like a crab, yet it really doesn't actually appear to be one. And again, here's where we've got something that is particularly interesting. The Wheel of Fate is the final boss at the end of the third game, the one boss that no matter how much money I put through, I can't beat. Almost all the rest of them I can spend my way through and I can kind of manage it this way around. The Wheel of Fate has got an incredibly precise, like tiny little points where you can actually fit in and kind of lose at things. So to some extent, the fact I always lose on him means that if anything, I'm kind of drawn to always be drawn into how fate itself is dragging me along. But again, we see on the actual rider-weight stuff here itself, something which is a complete absence within the games. Up in all of the corners here, we have 4 yellow characters. Does anyone recognise those symbols? Just on a quick show of hands. Okay, one. So what we have here, top corner, we have a man with wings, we have a bird with wings, which is more common, a lion with wings, and an ox with wings. The wings shows the angelic nature of them. These are the classical medieval representations of the 4 apostles, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They appear again, and we'll skip all the way through to the end. Justice, always like, I walk down corridors like justice is fun. Death. Again, we kind of get an interesting aspect. The uniform there particularly is quite an interesting thing. We go all the way to the world, because again we see it right at the end of the world as well. We see the same 4 stuff. And for a game that is entirely about how mankind is going to come across, pushing up in terms of what sort of things that they can do, almost all literature in the same sense talks about you shouldn't play God, and it's like kind of rejected from that perspective. And although that's kind of the message in the House of the Dead games, it's not shown through a religious lens. And it becomes even more interesting to see when you're kind of looking through and you're seeing something else which treats the same concepts, admittedly if they're only linked by name, in a slightly different way. The fact that we actually have consistently throughout the Rider-Waite all of these references directly to Christian mythology, and there is no reference whatsoever to any kind of religion within House of the Dead, I find that really interesting. And that's why I think it's almost always really interesting to take one thing that you know fairly well that has a link with something else and use that one thing to reevaluate what you understand about this thing here. And just as a minor point before I run away, again, just in terms of isolation, the world here itself, we've got the laurels all the way around, kind of almost representing success, representing all that has been achieved, but still kind of like guiding and protecting. The reason why the world can't escape and literally ruin the world is the fact that at this point it's actually trapped again within a kind of protected way. And it's the differences between what one thing can do in one situation and what one thing will do in a separate situation that really is kind of worth looking at. That is me 9 years ago, and my flatmate at the time, Ashley, and I do think that the vast majority of my student debt is because of House of the Dead 4. Again, I would say if you want to tweet me with your favourite bosses or the bosses you always die on, I will elaborate, I'll tell you what that means about you. But for a Tuesday evening in East London, you have been a wonderful audience. Thank you very, very much.